In this video tutorial, we're going to be building a working contact form using PHP that will actually send you an email with validation as well. Follow along, and I hope you learned something. Now the first step is to actually build the form. I'm actually not going to do this in this tutorial. I already have a video on where I cover exactly how to build this entire HTML form from scratch, all the HTML and CSS. This video is going to be dealing with actually doing the code that's required to actually make the form function. So the PHP and the backend code for the server-side validation and error messages. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, just to kind of show you how this form is set up, I just have a simple form and there's a few input fields. So I have a name, an email, a message, and then the actual, or a subject, and then the message. And then of course we can click on the send message button. So that's the way it works. There's obviously a bunch of CSS that does some fancy animation here as you type things in, but that's not the purpose of this video. I just wanted to show you how the form works. You can check down in the description. I'll have a link to where you can download this exact form and jump right in and follow along exactly with what I'm doing here. Now, notice that this form is called webform.php because we're going to be writing some code. This assumes that you have a working server, right, somewhere, either a local server, a development server, or a live host that runs PHP for your back end. So let's get going. Now, the first thing I want to do is come up here to the very top, and I'm going to open up some PHP tags and close some PHP tags. I'm going to show you how web forms work. So there's a couple important properties here in the actual form tag itself. The first is this thing called method equals post. So this determines how the form data is submitted to the server. So there's two options here, either post or get. If you choose post, all of the data will be sent behind the scenes invisible. If you send via get, it will post all of the form variables as get parameters in the actual URL. So this isn't a discussion on the difference between those two, but that's how this works. So I'm going to leave mine to post. And then the action parameter is where the form will send the data to. So in our case, my same page here, this webform.php file, is going to also be the file responsible for receiving the data. So in other words, I'm going to sort of submit this form page to itself. So I can come in here and just type in webform.php, but this could be an alternate page as well if I was going to submit the form to a different page to capture the data. A few other options and parameters inside of this form field that are important, especially if you're going to be dealing with file uploads. You'll need to set a few properties, but in our instance, we're not going to be doing that. So that's really all I need to make this happen. Now, inside of a web form, there's one important piece of information for every single input field. So notice I have this input field. I have an input, an input, an input, and then down here a text area. And they all have a parameter called name. So you can see this name equals, name equals, name equals. This is an arbitrary name. I can call this Andrew, I can call it Cool Beans, I can call it whatever I want. You just don't want to use spaces. But what happens here is this name parameter is what gets converted to the variable inside of PHP. So that's an important piece that you'll need to sort of make sure is unique. So you don't want to have the same one ever, because that will become variables. So what we're going to do is in PHP, all of those are converted into a super global called _post. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to echo out a pre-tag, and then I'll go ahead and close that pre-tag. And I'm only doing this so you can see how the data looks. So I'll close the pre-tag. Whoops. And then right here, we're going to do a command called print R. So print R stands for print recursive in PHP because this post variable is an array. So this will print out the variable. So notice by default over here, it says array, but it's empty. There's nothing in there at all right now. So what I can do is if I now fill in the form here, and I'll just say andrew@andrew.com, hello message, if I can type that correctly, and then hit send. Notice that my form just submitted the data to the server PHP, and now that _post variable, you can see here, is full of all of the data. And here's what I mean. Notice how each of the keys, this is an associative array, each of these keys correspond to the literal name parameter in your HTML. Okay, so that's where these keys are coming from in PHP. So now that you see that the data is submitted inside of an associative array, we can then do the PHP code to capture that data, assign some variables, and then build out an email. So what we're going to do, I'll do this fairly simply so you can follow along, is I'm going to set up basically a unique variable for each one of those pieces of data. So I'll set the username, we'll just set that equal to post sub name. Now I'm just going to copy and paste this down a few times here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have username, we have user email, we'll call this one. This one's called message subject. And then this one we'll just have it be called message. Okay. So then the post name, post email, post, this one's called subject. And this one is called message, right? Each of those keys corresponding to those keys. So all I'm doing here, whoops, saved the wrong thing. All I'm doing here is just assigning each of those pieces of data to a unique variable. This way I can then do my own error checking or check to make sure that things are correct in PHP on each piece fairly easily. Okay, so now that I have those, let's go ahead and set up the email. So we're going to set up a parameter for the to. So this is where do I want to send the email. So I can just say, blah@blah.com. I'll just say that for now. And then I'll say subject. So the subject is, actually we already have the subject. We don't need that one. So the subject is up here, message subject. So we need the body. So this is the email body. So by default, I'm just going to leave this as an empty string. And then I can, you can do some concatenation to add things. But what I'm going to do is we'll just sort of concatenate this. So I'll say body dot equals. And maybe I want to add in the username. So I'll say from colon. And then I'll concatenate here with the username. And then we'll say /r. This is a backslash /n, a /r /n. And what that does is this forces a line break in the email. So this will appear, and then the next piece of data will appear on a new line instead of all running in a single line. Okay, so I'm just going to copy this again and paste it down once, twice. So I'll say from, and then we'll say email, and then we'll put in the user email right here. And then we want to say maybe the message, and we'll put in the message right there. And that looks pretty good. I mean, again, we could put whatever we want in here in our email body. So you can just kind of customize that however you need. I'm going to grab this closing pre-tag and put this way up here underneath the print r command. Kind of move some of this stuff down a little bit. All right, now we just need to send the message. So to send the message, it's really easy. You just say mail. And this has, you can see here from my prompts, I'm going to scoot this over a little bit, but there's several parameters. So the first one is the to, the second one is the subject, the third one is the message, and then all the last parameters are all optional, but you can add headers and things like that. The headers would be used for things like your reply to address, or maybe BCC or CC, carbon copy and blind carbon copy, and things like that. We're not going to go over all of those, but that's how that works. So all I have to do is say mail. So the first parameter is the to, right? That's where the message will be sent to. The second parameter is the subject. So I already have that. So I'll just grab my message subject variable and stick it right there. And the third parameter is the message body. So that is the body. And finish that off with a semicolon. Now this will actually work. So if you're on a live server and you submit your form here, it will actually send you an email to this address and populate all the email with these pieces of data. Now, the downside here is there's no validation happening. So I'm going to delete this pre-tag here for just a minute. So the problem is that this code will run every single time the page is refreshed. And I don't want this code to run every single time. I only want this code to run if 1, the data is valid and true, and 2, if the user has actually submitted the form. If they haven't submitted the form, I don't want, obviously, to send a blank email. So what we're going to do next is add some validation. And so if the user has not submitted the form, they get the form. Once they hit send message, we'll hide the form and then give them a message that says thanks or something like that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to write an if statement. So we're going to say if the post, and I guess this is kind of dependent, right? What things are required, what things are not required on your form. There's a lot of ways you can do this. I'm just going to do a really simple one and make sure that there's at least a user email. Okay, so I'll say if is set. So if this value is set, and we can check to make sure it's not blank. You can do something like this. So this is basically saying if the post email is set and it's also not empty, because it can be set and not empty, which is a little bit goofy, then I can write, say, submit the form. Okay, so I'll just grab all of this code in here and paste it right here. So this is basically validating one of my parameters, right? This is checking to make sure the form has data before we allow submit. But what we also want to do for is sanitize the data or make sure the data is not malicious and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways you can do that, of course. All I'm going to do is just make sure that the email address itself is valid. If it is a valid email, then I'm going to go ahead and assume the data is good and send it. Again, that's a really simple example, but for this tutorial, that should suffice. So let's write another little check in here to make sure the form is valid. Now I'm going to comment that mail out really quick so I don't send myself blank emails. So there is a PHP function called filter variable, which allows me to take a variable and filter it by some criteria built into PHP. So what I can do is I can say if filter var, so if filter variable, and then I'm going to pass in the variable. So this is going to be the post email. That's the first parameter. Let me space this out a little bit so it's a little easier to read. And then the second parameter is what type of filter you're doing. So the one I'm going to be doing is called the filter valid. There it is. That's that one right there. Filter validate email. So this is a built-in PHP function that will make sure that the data is an actual email address. Now, it doesn't make sure it's a working email address. It just makes sure that the format of the email is correct. So it's something at something dot something with the proper host names and whatnot. So we can do one more if statement, and then I'll go ahead and cut all this code and paste it inside of there. So we kind of have two nested ifs, but this is an easy way, I think, for you to read and understand it. So the first one says, if we actually have an email entered, go to the next check. This one says, if the email is actually valid, then go ahead, set up the email and mail it. Okay. So that is how that works. Now we're going to set up one more variable here. I'm actually not going to mail the message because I'm actually working on a server that works and I don't want to send myself spam. We're going to set up a variable that's just called message sent equals true or something like this. Else message sent, I guess we could say, is false. Just to kind of show you a quick little Boolean operation here. So in other words, if we sent the mail, we say, okay, it's true. Otherwise, we say false or something like that. Now, what we want to probably do is we need to set up a default for this. So we'll just assume, in fact, we don't even need an else here. Let's just go ahead and set the default up to be false. So at the very top here, we'll say message sent is false. So we're always going to assume that the email is not sent and only in this one instance does it change to true. Okay, we can then use this variable, because it's a Boolean, true or false, to determine if we want to show the form or hide the form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'll write a little bit of PHP code. I guess I'll just do this right here for lack of a better place. So I will write a statement that says if, and then I'm going to check to see if this thing is true or false, the message sent. So I'll copy this. If the message sent, and then I'll write some PHP code down here. Again, I'm doing this in separate PHP blocks because I'm going to be adding some HTML. And I like to keep my HTML and PHP separate. So if the message was sent, I'll just type a header 3. Thanks, we'll be in touch. So they'll just get a message that says this. And then I'll write else. So if the message was not sent, the else statement will fire. And then all this code in between here, right? The div I'll display. And then lastly, I'll go ahead and close off that else statement by saying end if. Okay. So you can kind of see how this works now. So I'm going to come up here and hit return to get this back to its default state. So the code gets written down through here. So we have no post, so all this is ignored. We keep cruising down, So here's our next block. It says, if the message was sent, display this message. Well, this is false, so this is going to be ignored. This will happen on the first page. Of course, I'm seeing my form. So if I come in here, fill the data out, and then go ahead and hit send. So it's going to submit the form to itself. This time we get the message that says, thanks, we'll be in touch. And the email would have actually sent had I not commented out this line, of course. So now I'm getting my if message sent. Sure enough, the H3 appears. And that's pretty much it. The last thing I'll do, just to kind of show you how you can add some validation in if something went wrong, is easily enough, we can come in here and I'll just come into here and assume, let's just write an else. So if for some reason the email did not validate as a valid email, we'll write an else statement in here and we'll just say invalid equals form dash invalid. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically setting up a variable that's going to house a string that I'll then use this string to attach to my HTML input field that then I can style with CSS. So let's walk through this logic again. If the email did not pass this validation attempt, I could then say, okay, set up a new variable called invalid class name, and it's called form invalid or something like this. So then I can come down and I'll write some code down in this email on the input field. So I could say, add that invalid class name or blank. So this is a PHP 7 command that says, if this exists, add it. Otherwise, don't do anything. Just make it blank. Okay. So now let's go ahead and see if this will work for us. So we'll come back and refresh this form. Now, the problem here is that the browser itself has built-in HTML5 validation. So I actually won't even be able to submit this form if it's not already a valid email. So to test this out, I'm actually going to, instead of having this invalid class name be set up on the email, just for example's sake, I'm going to set it up on the name, because this one is not an email field, so it doesn't require an email. So we'll just set that to name. Everything else should be fine. And then down here, let's grab that PHP code that I just added. And where did I add that? There it is. And we'll go ahead and add this up on the name one. Okay, So to see this work, let's pull this over and we're going to inspect our element. And we're going to cruise down to kind of see this happen. So I'm going to inspect this top one. Okay, so right now you can see that by default my form element or this input does not have that class name. Oops, I added that in the wrong spot. Sorry, I got to hurry and fix this. We need to add this class name, not just hanging out by itself, but we need to add it inside of the actual class attribute there. Okay, there we go. Okay, so you can see that this class just says form control right now. So if I fill this form out, this first value is not a valid email, so it should fail when I hit send message. And we'll go ahead and hit send message, and you can see sure enough, it failed. And when I returned, now look at this, I get that form invalid. So this is what we call server-side validation, right? Where I check to make sure things are valid or not. And if they're not, I can dynamically insert in specific CSS pieces into my form. I can then use CSS to style this accordingly. So I'm just going to come over here to my form invalid. I'll create a new little rule in my CSS, just down here at the bottom. So we'll say form invalid, and we'll say outline 1 pixel solid red. And because I might be overriding this earlier, I can't remember how I set that CSS up. I'll just go ahead and say important. And there you go. So you can see now it turns red because that is, let's do 2 pixels or something a little bit bigger. It outlines it, telling me that that form field is invalid. So let's fill this out one more time here. So we'll make it invalid again. I'll hit send message. It's not going to send, and it tells me what's wrong with it. Now let's go ahead and make it valid and send. So I'll say blah at blah.com. blah.com, hello, test, send. Everything is valid. PHP works, and it actually mails off the contact message, and it should show up in your inbox. So that is how you can use PHP to build a working web form that will mail you the contents of the document. Now you'll want to definitely look a little bit more into some of the validation techniques and make sure that you're validating all of your form fields. And there's a bunch of pre-existing libraries that will automatically handle that for you. But I hope you learned something in this tutorial. Please like, subscribe, share the content, and we'll see you in the next one.